The night my daughter took her first breath, something broke open inside me, not like shattered glass, more like a door that had been sealed for years, finally groaning apart under the weight of everything I had been refusing to feel. I held her in my arms in that hospital room in Minnesota, and for the first time in my adult life, I felt the word God form somewhere deep inside me without cynicism attached to it, without the instinctive scoff, without the reflex to dismiss it. I was not prepared for that moment. I had spent years constructing a life without that word in it, years of convincing myself that faith was weakness, that religion was nothing more than mythology that humanity had not yet outgrown. I was for a long time very proud of that conviction, and now holding 8 pounds of undeniable miracle in my arms, something in me knew that pride had been wrong. But I am getting ahead of myself. Let me go back to the beginning. I grew up in the Lutheran church in Minnesota. My family was fairly practicing. We attended services regularly. I participated in Bible study. I sang in the choir. I went through confirmation. I did all the things a sincere Christian girl was supposed to do, and I did them genuinely. I wanted to believe. I wanted to feel what I saw other people in those pews feeling. That warmth, that certainty, that quiet peace of knowing you were held by something infinitely larger than yourself. Yet despite being surrounded by the rituals of faith, a deep, pervasive sense of emptiness lingered within me. I had questions. Sincere, honest questions that would not leave me alone. Questions about the Trinity, about why an all-powerful God would require the death of his own Son to forgive the very creation he himself had made. About salvation, about grace, about the parts of Scripture that seemed to contradict each other in ways that nobody could explain to my satisfaction. I brought these questions to pastors, to teachers, to my parents, and every single time I felt the answers fall short. Not because people were not trying, they were, but the explanations always asked me to accept something that reason could not comfortably hold, and eventually I could no longer pretend that I could. When I left home at 17, under circumstances that were painful, that involved my family in ways I will not go into detail about, I also left the church behind, and the door did not close gently, it slammed. Within months, I had transformed from a questioning Christian into something I carried with a kind of fierce, intellectual pride. I was a hardcore atheist, not the quiet, private kind, the kind that argued, that debated, that felt an almost righteous satisfaction in dismantling other people's beliefs with science and logic. I read everything available to reinforce that worldview. I surrounded myself with people who thought identically. And for a time, I genuinely told myself this was freedom. But, while atheism provided a temporary solace, the cold comfort of having decided, of having permanently closed the question, I cannot honestly say I was at peace. There was a particular kind of loneliness that came with believing the universe was fundamentally indifferent, that love was nothing more than chemistry, that the people I cared for would simply cease to exist one day, their entire lives amounting to nothing more than a brief disturbance in an infinite void. I pushed those realizations down, deep and hard. I became very skilled at pushing them down. In my early 20s, the sharp edges began to soften. I began calling myself agnostic, not because I had discovered anything that shifted my thinking, but because the intellectual honesty I prided myself on forced me to admit a difficult truth. I could not actually prove the absence of God any more than believers could prove his presence. I settled into a comfortable uncertainty. I told myself the question was simply unanswerable, and I left it there. And I stayed there for years. And then, in 2015, my daughter was born. I remember the exact moment with a precision that has not faded in the years since. I remember her weight. I remember her face, this perfectly formed, impossibly small human being. And the feeling that came over me was unlike anything I had words for. There was a recognition there, something that bypassed every intellectual framework I had spent years carefully constructing. This was not random. This was not the result of blind, indifferent processes colliding accidentally into something that mattered. Something in me knew, not theorized, not hoped, knew, with a certainty that shook me deeply, that this child had been given to me, that I was accountable, that there was a someone to be accountable to. I did not know what to do with that knowledge. It frightened me. So I sat with it quietly for months, watching it grow, afraid to look at it directly. I began to read, not the combative atheist literature I had once reached for reflexively, but philosophy, history, theology, arguments for the existence of God that I had previously dismissed without genuinely engaging. The cosmological argument, the fine-tuning of the universe, the staggering precise complexity of physical constants calibrated to extraordinary exactness for existence itself to be possible. For the first time in years, I could not wave these arguments away. Something in me was leaning forward, listening. I must emphasize this. My heart was moving before my mind fully understood where it was going. Something was drawing me, gently, with great patience, toward a truth I had not yet been able to name. It was through a colleague at work, a quiet, profoundly dignified Muslim woman, that the word Islam entered my awareness as something more than a distant cultural abstraction. She never preached to me, she never pushed, but I watched her. I watched the way she moved through difficult days with a composure that came from somewhere real and deep, not from performance. I watched the way she spoke about her faith, not with the desperate fervor of someone trying to convince themselves, but with the settled certainty of someone who had long since arrived somewhere solid. One afternoon, I gathered the courage to ask her what she believed, about God, about who He was. She looked at me thoughtfully and said, "We believe God is one, completely, absolutely, purely one. He has no son, He has no partner. He needs nothing from His creation. He simply is." Something struck deep inside my chest with those words. The same questions I had carried since childhood, the questions that had driven me out of the church at 17, were being answered not with paradox or mystery that I was asked to accept blindly, but with a clarity that my reason could actually hold. How could the Almighty, the supreme creator of the universe, the one who fashioned the endless skies and the precise order of all existence, need a son? How could the divine be divided? I began to read the Quran. I want to describe what that experience was like, but I am genuinely not sure language is sufficient for it. There is a quality to the Quran, to reading it with a heart that is truly open, that I had never encountered in any other text. It speaks with an authority unlike the authority of any human voice. It does not argue. It does not persuade in the way human writing persuades. It simply declares truth, and something in the marrow of you recognizes it as such, as if you were hearing something you had always known, returned to you at last. The realization that came as I read was not a single dramatic moment. It was a tide coming in, slow, irresistible, unmistakable. Verse by verse, chapter by chapter, I felt the emptiness I had carried since childhood beginning, at last, to fill. The questions I had brought to every church and every pastor and every teacher for 20 years were being answered, not with complexity, not with contradiction wrapped in mystery, with a directness, a clarity, a mercy I had never encountered before. I sat alone in my living room one night while my daughter slept, reading Surah Al-Ikhlas for the first time, those 4 short verses that describe the absolute oneness and completeness of God, and I wept, not from sadness, from something I had no name for, from the particular, overwhelming feeling of recognizing that you have been searching for something your entire life, and that you are finally, for the very first time, no longer searching. I sat there weeping, overwhelmed by a divine presence I could not explain, and I thought to myself, I do not know all the prayers yet. I do not know all the words, but I feel like I understand everything. A few weeks later, with my colleague beside me and my heart trembling with something I can only call awe, I pronounced the Shahada. I bear witness that there is no God but Allah, and I bear witness that Muhammad is his messenger. There are no words, in English, in any language I know, adequate to what I felt in that moment. Every question I had ever asked, every year of emptiness, every night I spent pushing down the thought that nothing mattered, every door that had closed, all of it, had been quietly, patiently leading me here, to this, to a blazing, undeniable light that I had been walking toward without knowing it since the very beginning. Assalamu alaikum, my brothers and sisters. My name is Sarah. I grew up lost in Minnesota, and on the day I said those words, I finally came home.